Today's topic is the first in a three-part series with the fabulous folks from the Content Advisory Group, how to make content marketing work for you. And I'm very happy to introduce Tim, the Dr. Walters, who will take you through part one, the 4 content marketing models and which one is right for you. Now, I've worked with Tim for a good decade now, and I can assure you the nickname Doctor comes for a good reason. For over 20 years, actually, Tim has helped organizations to create great content and customer experiences. And what's really interesting is that he's also a privacy expert, which I find is a very intriguing combination of the two topics. But without further ado, Tim, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Sonia. It's a tremendous pleasure to be with you again, this time on a virtual stage. And I look forward to the next time we're going to be on a real stage. So let me begin with 2 quick housekeeping notes of my own. The first one is literally one word about, excuse me, the Content Advisory, or TCA, which is the Consulting and Educational Division of the Content Marketing Institute. And that one word is .net, as you'll notice at the footer of this slide, not .com. So keep that in mind when you come looking for our content and service offerings on content marketing, content strategy, customer experience, and as Sonia said, data privacy as well. Secondly, as Sonia mentioned, and as you probably noticed when registering for the webinar, we're not satisfied giving you only one great webinar, so we're going to make this the first part of a 3-part series, and we're sure this is a fully integrated series, and we're sure you'll get tremendous value out of attending all 3 of them. So next, on April 7th, my colleague Kathy McKnight will build upon the models that we're discussing today and address a governance framework for content operations. And then on May 12th, TCA founder Robert Rose will tie it all together from a content experience perspective with a specific focus on measuring your success and progress. Great, so let's get started, and let's start right at the beginning with the next slide, with the agenda. So yeah, quickly, why bother with content models at all? Then we'll cover the 4 models, we'll discuss why it's not a maturity model, introduce the need for strategic planning in production, and then do a quick overview of the self-assessment tool that we're distributing to all of you today as well. So if we start right at the beginning by asking, why should we care about content marketing models? You might be thinking, or maybe you might hear from someone in your organization, why don't we just get started? I mean, we've got so much content to produce, we've got so much work to do, we know how to write or otherwise produce content, so why take up time with this stuff? Let's just get to it. And the answer to this question or objection comes from this guy who probably none of you recognize, but this is Steven Sinofsky, who was for a long time, or for a time in any case, the president of the Windows division at Microsoft, and he's well known as a writer about product management, product marketing, product development. And Sinofsky is most famous for saying, don't ship the org chart. Now, this seems like straightforward, commonsensical advice. You know, make sure that what you're offering, whether it's software like Windows, a device like a phone, or for all of us today, something less tangible, but undoubtedly more important, like content and customer experiences, make sure that it's built to satisfy the customer needs and desires instead of reflecting your internal organizational structure, your silos, your turf battles, your budget constraints. It's just, as I say, commonsensical advice. But of course, this doesn't mean that it's easy to follow this advice. If you've been around the management of the website or the intranet at your organization for any amount of time at all, you know how bitterly every business unit, every division, every function fights for what they consider to be their share of the real estate, or maybe more than their share. And so we end up all the time with sites that quite precisely and usually quite disastrously ship the org chart. But it turns out that when Sinofsky says don't ship the org chart, he doesn't actually mean you shouldn't ship the org chart. In fact, he means something almost precisely the opposite. Don't ship the org chart isn't a warning about something you should strive to avoid. It's rather a statement of fact about something that is, in his view, unavoidable. Namely, he means, and I've confirmed this with Sanofsky, you will ship the org chart. It is inevitable, it's inescapable, it's preordained, it's like a natural law. And in fact, Sanofsky was very deliberately invoking what's called Conway's Law. Dr. Melvin Conway was a computer scientist and a developer, and in 1968, he formulated this rather complex sentence you see on the left, but you can ignore that because it can be neatly summarized as organizational design is product design. And so in terms of your products as marketers, content and communications, what Steve and Melvin teach us is that since you're inevitably going to communicate in the way that you're organized, that's the law, then you'd better make sure you're organized in the way that you want to communicate. And this is so important because it's what we see as the crucial missing link that is keeping organizations from creating great, consistently successful content operations. Ultimately, content is the experience we're trying to create. We're trying to create immersive experiences for audiences and consumers all over the buyer's journey, and how well a business communicates is in direct correlation with how much importance it puts on content as a strategic part of their business. So when we see content succeeding in an organization, it's typically happening in one of four content operating models. And these are characterized on the left axis by whether they are internal focused versus more externally focused, building audiences that can be monetized over time. And then on the bottom axis, we have a departmental strategy shading over into an integrated business strategy. So the quick and easy way to explain and distinguish these four models is to look at the products that they typically produce or the services that they typically offer. So we begin with the player model, which is certainly the most common and the one we're going to dive into today. And this is often, it can be one or it's often two or three people, although it could be many more. We sometimes call this the Bob and Margaret model because we'll be at a conference and Margaret will come up and say, "Hi, I'm Margaret, and this is my colleague Bob. We are content for our company." And so Bob and Margaret are trying to fulfill the needs of the business, creating and merchandising content as it's needed, basically producing infographics and ebooks and sales sheets and populating the blog on the website and maybe writing, keynote addresses for the CEO. And then the processor model in the lower right, this is content as a service. So this is still more internally focused. Now maybe you've got a team or teams that are working on SEO strategy, localization, scalability, best practices, guidelines. They're basically setting the standards for how content will be created and managed wherever in the organization it's created and managed, or also by outsourced agencies and freelancers. And then in the upper left is the performer model, where we're focused on building external audiences. So maybe now you've got an editorial team that's managing a resource center or dedicated blogs or even a print magazine or video channel, discrete immersive experiences focused on nurturing those audiences. And finally, we see content as a platform or content as a business, where it's not only getting created as a marketing and sales tactic, but maybe even as an integrated strategy to become revenue generating in its own right, where content is performing as a product and audiences are treated as customers. Now, this is very important. It's very tempting, it's almost unavoidable to look at this as a maturity model, where you start out with baby steps as a player, and then you grow up to become a platform content business. And there is some elements of truth in this. You almost always do start out in the player model, and platform is kind of an aspiration for most content organizations. But still, it's very misleading to see these as stages that an organization passes through on the way to mature content marketing. And there are two key reasons why you want to avoid this mistake. First, let's take Red Bull as a great example of the platform model. And what content marketer doesn't want to be, like Red Bull Media House? Well, of course, although Red Bull exemplifies the platform model, Red Bull is still serving the needs of the internal divisions and nurturing external audiences and conducting really great SEO, localization, content standards. In short, every successful content operation is a combination of all four models in different combinations, depending on the needs and the nature of the business and your consumers or audiences at that given time. So the actual answer to the subtitle of the webinar, which model is best for you, is that while most do probably start out as players and eventually, hopefully soon as possible, reach the platform level, everyone is some combination of all four in a way that reflects the needs and goals of the business. So that means when you look at any given organization on this model, the overall mix would appear as a kind of spider graph. So 3M, for example, focuses a lot of attention on setting standards and guidelines for the production of content throughout the business and by their partners. Whereas Symantec and Capital Group, for example, emphasize managing a portfolio of external facing media assets. So you note here that it's 50% performer, 25 each player and processor, and 0% platform. So when I say that any given organization is a mix of all four, nevertheless, it could be 0% out of one of those four, as it is here for the platform model. Now, the second and even more important reason to avoid thinking of the models as progressive stages of maturity is that although the player model comes first, that doesn't make it a childish stage that you want to try to escape from as quickly as you can. It comes first because it is the starting point and the foundation for everything that follows. The player model prepares the ground and builds what I'll call the lattice work from which the performer, processor, and ultimately platform models will emerge and grow. Or at least it should serve that foundational function. But let's first consider what happens if it doesn't, or might say when it doesn't, because it often fails to serve that foundational function. So say you've got an early stage player model. Marketing content operations consist, as we said, of Bob and Margaret. They're responsible for everything. They get requests, or more often demands, as some of you know, from across the organization for white papers, blog posts, tech sheets, videos, slide decks, whatever it is. Now, they're hardworking, dedicated, talented professionals. Let me build this out, I think. Right. In this picture, Margaret is working remotely, I guess. So quarter after quarter, Bob and Margaret are working harder and harder, and no surprise to us, their content is having an impact on the business, on brand identity, on leads and sales, which means they get even more requests for even more content from even more parts of the organization. And at the end of those 4 quarters, at the end of a year, what's the result? They've got a big pile of assets. And because Bob and Margaret are industrious and efficient, it's a very big pile of assets. As Robert Rose likes to say, they've got assets coming out of their assets. And because Bob and Margaret are talented, a lot of these are very high quality assets, but they're utterly disconnected. They don't tell a coherent story about the brand or the products. They don't leverage previous work. And of course, they don't build a connected experience for prospects and buyers. And worst of all, this kind of approach isn't capable of building a foundation for the future. Because if you think about it, if the individual order givers in sales, in marketing, in comms, etc., are happy with the assets that they're getting, well, they're going to think, why not grow the team? So now Bob and Margaret are joined by Bill and Carol and Ted and Alice, and they're all producing more content, which is breaking up into silos and introducing even more disconnection and redundancy and inefficiency. In short, left to itself, the player model not only doesn't evolve towards the other models, it actually devolves. It gets further from long-term success. And in fact, it will inevitably collapse under its own weight. And that will probably then disastrously be marked down as a failure of content marketing. So obviously we want to avoid this fate. And avoiding that fate means investing in the work of what I just called earlier, preparing the ground and building the lattice for future growth. Without a planned and purposeful approach, content production will just remain, at best, ad hoc, non-strategic, and has no path to move forward. Now, at this point, the Bobs and Margarets in the audience are thinking, wait a second, we're already killing ourselves producing all the content demanded by everybody around the company, and now TCA wants us to also invest in this strategic planning. But here's the thing, thinking strategically doesn't really cost you a dime, and it doesn't take that much time either. Thinking about what you'll create and having a vision and a plan to do it is not terribly resource intensive, but it does ensure that your content efforts are able to move forward, and then it does save you huge amounts of time, effort, and money when you are ready to take the next step, because now you already know precisely what step to take, rather than blindly starting down some random path that could well turn out to be a dead end. And the key elements of such thinking at the player model stage are strategic planning and scalable production processes. So strategic planning calls for creating, in the first instance, an editorial board. And the board, as we see here, we've split off an editorial board from the content operations. And the board coordinates, or actually I prefer to say orchestrates, the entire content marketing ecosystem, from the underlying technologies and services to the guidelines and the calendars and the efforts of content creators, whether they're, again, on staff, freelance, or agency. Now, true, at the Bob and Margaret stage, the editorial board might not actually exist. It might not be a thing, but the thing is that Bob and Margaret should try to think and act like an editorial board. They should reflect the functions of a board, such as vetting, filtering, and proactively suggesting content ideas, such as trying to ensure consistency of tone and style and brand story, and such as keeping up to date on technologies and services that can accelerate or improve content production, and taking an active role in selecting those technologies and services. And that means that as the content team grows, these processes, these strategic planning processes and habits are already in place to be then taken up by new hires and eventually taken over when you do create a dedicated editorial board. Secondly, scalable production is about ensuring that the decisions of the editorial board, that both strategy and tactic decisions, can be efficiently, consistently, and you guessed it, scalably executed and realized. And these decisions flow first to a central content team that's responsible for defining and planning and distributing the work. And again, this might initially be not a separate team, but one person's reflections and the corresponding flow chart that they build on a spreadsheet. And then the work flows to the content execution teams that execute content production. And this could be anywhere in the organization or otherwise. If the editorial board, in short, is orchestrating the content ecosystem, then the content and execution teams are the players in the orchestra. As this structure grows and evolves, you can also map out specific roles, responsibilities, skill sets, expertise that you want to hire or outsource or develop internally. For example, a content program manager coordinates between the board and the execution team, monitors budgets and so forth. An audience development manager may be soliciting needs from business units, but is also proactively promoting and understanding the development of big story tent poles that we'll talk about a little later on. And on the lower right, important for content stack, we have the technology experts who understand the tool sets like the content management system, but also understand the work and daily needs of the production teams. Now, my colleague Kathy McKnight will drill down into these roles and profiles in her webinar with Content Stack on April 7th. So here's a kind of conceptual architecture for the combined strategic planning and production process. So for the sake of the illustration over here on the left, we assume 60% proactive strategic project work and 40% reactive, which is feeding to and responding to the needs of the business. At an earlier stage, this mix might be only 10% proactive. It might be only 1% proactive. But again, the important thing is to begin thinking and planning in these terms. Whatever the split is, it's determined by the editorial board, or what's functioning in editorial board, which is taking input from across the organization and deciding how much weight to give to each request, basically, or whether to approve a request at all. And then the outputs from the board flow, the blue arrows, to support business needs for the reactive work or to the production of strategic projects. We'll look at that in a little more detail in the next slide. All the content assets, whether proactive or reactive, enter the production cycle: plan, build, distribute, manage. And this includes things like transcreation or localization, and critically, the application of consistent metadata, content structures, and deployment for the underlying technologies. Now, this looks like it's complicated. It's a complicated diagram, and it sounds like it might be complicated to be a part of it. And here again, you'll often get the objection that the editorial board and the strategic planning process is just slowing things down. It's creating friction. It's putting sand in the gears. It's getting in the way of us producing content as quickly as we possibly can, which seems like job one. But experience shows every time that the benefits of planning exactly what you're going to produce and what you're not going to produce, when, and producing it in a consistent manner that allows you to get the maximum amount of use and value and reuse out of it, all of this far outweighs any friction that is introduced in this process. And finally, on the right-hand side, the activation stage isn't only about deploying the content across channels and the organization, but crucially about measuring the impact, which doesn't only feed back to the production process as illustrated here, but of course feeds all the way back to the editorial board for their ongoing strategic planning. And as mentioned, Robert Rose will have much more to say about measurement in his webinar with Content Stack on May 12th. So here's a slightly different view of the workflow for reactive and proactive content, just to show that reactive is measured by how well, or typically measured by how well and often it services internal needs, which may include unanticipated needs that the content teams have merchandised the content for. And proactive work should be measured not just by support for marketing and comms goals or sales goals, but as you evolve into that performer model, it also is going to be measured by how it is used to acquire and nurture audiences. Finally, this illustrates clearly how the editorial board and strategic planning can really accelerate and lighten the burden of content production, allowing teams to be both more creative and more efficient rather than slowing it down. So we like to think in terms of this as in terms of producing molecular content or cloning content. And it works like this. The board settles on a big story idea or a thematic pillar, sometimes called a tentpole. This could be for a campaign, for a new service, or for the brand as a whole. And there will be several operating at once in any given organization. The first benefit is that this allows content teams to say no to requests from the business that don't fit or conflict with these big themes. So that immediately increases consistency. Then we enter the production process, and assets are created for multiple channels and multiple purposes in multiple versions and formats. And you do this, or you're advised to do this, even if they will not be used immediately, because it's far easier to spin off another format or another version at this point than it is to set up the entire production process again for one asset when you realize 2 weeks later that you need it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you should create versions or formats that you know you're never going to use. And then the assets are assembled and structured and published by trained experts and the managers of the CMS and the digital asset management system, so that metadata and structures and reuse is all taken into account and enforced consistently. Now, of course, you can, and you almost certainly will, adopt this approach in phases. But you can see that it means you're not only able to support omni-channel experiences, but you're also able to ensure that they are coherent and integrated. And it means that the content team won't have to produce numerous great ideas. Rather, a few big ideas are transformed into many different iterations and executions for different parts of various customer journeys. Now, it might go without saying, but in this context, it's also worth calling out. Since we're talking about supporting many different channels and formats and content types, and indeed new channels and types are constantly emerging that we haven't even yet anticipated, then the content technology that supports this strategy should not be channel specific, should not be, say, a content management system that is designed primarily to support websites at the potential expense of all of the other publishing outputs and touch points that you need to manage. So here's the summary. Without strategic thinking, content marketing will never get out of the player model, and eventually even that model will collapse under its own weight. Strategic thinking about content is never really constrained by resources. Even the smallest teams can begin to develop the habits and implement the structures for editorial board type decisions and scalable content production. So the advice is build the foundation and processes that will allow you to accelerate and ease your strategic content evolution. But don't go away, because that's the summary of that part of the presentation. But I'm now going to take the remaining few minutes to introduce you to the self-assessment tool that we're providing for all of you.
And Tim, thank you. If I may just remind our participants to check the chat option in the control panel at the bottom or the top of your screen. You'll find the link to the worksheet that Tim is going to walk you through now. So please do download and let us know in the chat if you have any issues. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, so this self-assessment, it's a high-level tool that can help identify both misalignments within your team or internally, and the three most common imbalances with suggestions for how to address the challenges that those imbalances pose. So you're asked to assess your organization's status on three criteria, which we'll review in a moment. And when I say you, I mean you in the singular. We want you to complete the assessment individually, not as a group. And we'd like to have numerous people complete it. So this could be across the entire content organization, of course, editorial board members, channel managers, content producers, agency partners perhaps, and it could conceivably include other stakeholders like the CMO, who's not directly involved with content production. If you're, and also if you're not actively involved in some area as you're trying to apply the score, like you just don't have great insight into one of the areas, still, it's a good idea to give some kind of score. Use your best judgment about the status of the organization as a whole, even if you're not directly involved. Okay, so what you're going to see is a scoring sheet, a very simple scoring sheet for tabulating the results like this. You see that we're asking you to rate each one of the four models across each one of these three criteria. So the first task is rank your organization's maturity level for each model on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, the full assessment that you're downloading has detail about what each score means. But you see that it basically runs from 1, we don't do this at all. We don't have any activity in, say, the processor model. 3 means we do this and we're kind of okay at it. 5 means we rock at this and really ought to be a case study for how this particular content model serves an organization. And by the way, if you outsource most or all of the activities in any one of the 4 models, say you have an agency that takes over full responsibility for running a joint digital and print magazine for you, something like that, that still counts as your organization being active in that model. So you should score it accordingly. Second, we want you to state the percentage of your total efforts that are expended on any one of the 4 particular models, on each of the 4 models. So percentage includes time, budget, resources that the team spends on delivering this content operating model to the business. Now, of course, the total percentages across the 4 models must add up to 100%. So recall, for example, that publishing-focused spider graph for Symantec that we saw earlier, which had them spending 50% of their effort on the performer model and 25% each on the player and processor and 0 on platform. And finally, rank your organization's future need or desire to engage with each model. So here, a score of 1 means we have no future need. Now, this could be because you've determined that it's not appropriate for your business. We're just not ever going to use the performer model, for example. But it could also be because you're already engaged in this model as fully and as well as you want to be. So we don't have a future need to engage in performer because we're already engaged with it and quite happy with our performance in that area. And then again, in the middle of the road here, 3 is we're engaged and generally happy with our performance, but there's room for improvement. And 5 means you recognize that this is a crucial future need that will be spun up in the near term. And that's it. You know, it really should take a few minutes to do the assessment. The hardest part, if they want to call it that, is understanding what the scores mean. So you know why you're giving a 3 rather than a 4, for example. But now is when the fun begins. Now is when you want to bring together everyone as a group, everyone who completed the assessment if possible. And first, you look for internal disagreements or lack of consensus. For example, let's say the editorial board members think that content ops should be spending 25% of their time on the processor model, but the people who are actually responsible for ops say that they're spending 40% of their time on that particular model. So clearly in that case, priorities and or resources need to be sorted out so that you can come to an agreement. Probably the most common variation you'll see in this regard is rankings in the future need area, future need or desire for a given model. So let's say that you're at that happy point where you're bringing on board professional journalists to apply some rocket fuel to your content marketing. And given their training and skills and background, it's not going to be surprising that they're eager to get active in the performer and platform models right away. They want to be Red Bull Media House tomorrow. And in fact, that's probably why you hired them. But if there are disagreements in any of these areas, now is your chance to surface those and then to work them out and work them into your overall strategic plan. Secondly, the second review exercise, the full assessment that you're getting has detailed descriptions of what we see as the 3 most common misbalances within or among the content models. So we're looking here for highs versus lows. On the 1 to 5 rankings for maturity and future need, a high score is a 4 or a 5, and a low score is a 1 or a 2. On the percentage effort ranking, high is 50% or more, and low is 20% or less. So for example, if you come up with, in a given model, a result of high maturity, high effort, and low perceived need, that could indicate, it doesn't have to indicate, but it could well indicate that a high-performing content team is delivering on that model and delivering well, but it has become siloed, perhaps to the detriment of other models, or to the detriment of other parts of the business, supports for other parts of the business. And finally, the full tool, as I said, provides recommended steps to take you, and recommended steps for you to take if you uncover one of these misbalances in your organization. And of course, you're also welcome to chat with us at TCA if you want to discuss your results of the self-assessment. So that's it for the overview. A quick reminder here, just visually, that this is one of 3 parts, and we can move to Q&A with Sonia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. That was super insightful and hands-on. Thank you for that. Thank you all for staying on the line and participating. We do have actually a few questions, and we have, 8 minutes left, so we won't make it through all of them. If your question isn't answered, we'll follow up after the webinar. The first question that I want to ask you, because I do think it's super relevant for everybody, Tim, comes from Kendra. She says that she'd be really curious to hear, particularly in the B2B space, about the use of Agile and Scrum for marketing and content, and if you have any feedback about that approach and what you've seen.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of, I don't want to call it buzz because that sounds like I'm calling it hype, around a lot of talk and interest around agile marketing, agile marketing production processes and so forth. And I don't think, you don't want to take a stand on it one or another, like agile yay or nay. It depends entirely upon what's going to be appropriate for your organization at any given, any given point of its need, the needs of the business and the needs of your customers and prospects and your audiences that you're trying to support. But in general, the notion of introducing more flexibility and more agility into the content production processes is welcome whenever you can do so without without allowing it to become chaotic. That is, you want to make it as flexible as possible without it beginning to fall apart or the joints coming loose.
So to sort of follow up on that, what's the biggest pitfall you've seen teams transitioning to an agile model run into?
Basically taking some agile model or their understanding or some manager's understanding of an agile model and trying to follow it blindly without adapting it to the particular needs of the organization.
That makes sense. Cool. Then this question actually comes from Bob. I'm not sure if it is your Bob or if this is a coincidence.
Bob and Margaret.
Yes, indeed. So he says, Robert Rose has been talking about villains for content stories, and how does that work for companies?
Oh, that's a great question. I love this. Okay, so.
And Bob, Robert is going to do the 3rd webinar.
Yes,
so
yes, exactly.
Again, but Tim,
let me see if I risk this. So I'm going to let you in. I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. Actually, it's not that secret because Robert has talked about this openly, but I don't think I've ever confessed this. And that is, Robert and I are both wannabe screenwriters. And when I say wannabe, I mean we're failed screenwriters. So we've got a big soft spot for teachings and methods that come from screenwriting and storytelling. And if you know Robert, you know that very well. Teachers like Robert McKee, elements like the hero's journey, the narrative arc, and villains. And fortunately for us, this isn't just a soft spot in our heads, but these things actually work really, really well when you're producing content, because changing content from a product promotion to a well-constructed story just naturally makes it engaging. It makes it more attractive. It makes it something people are going to look for with a sense of anticipation. But still, you could, scratch your head about, okay, I get it. I get the story model, but how do I come up with a villain for a company that produces ceiling tiles or industrial pumps? So here's the quick tip. Your villain is almost never the competition. The people that you're competing with are not your villain. So Uber's villain is not Lyft and vice versa. Rather, Uber and Lyft's villain, they have the same villain. That is, it's other ways of getting around, you know, taking a taxi, driving your own car, taking the subway, you know, an e-scooter, a bike, whatever. Or again, another example, Reed Hastings at Netscape says their greatest enemy isn't Amazon Prime or movie theaters. What is it? It's sleep. People are going to go to sleep rather than watching another episode of, you know, Game of Thrones or whatever. Airbnb's villain isn't other hotel chains, right? It's not taking the trip at all. And their data backs this up. People don't choose between should I stay in an Airbnb or should I stay in Four Seasons? They say, should I go to that weekend in Paris? Should I go to Miami over Labor Day? Right? Yes or no, right? It's whether or not they're going to take the trip. And you see this in Airbnb's content because it's all about adventure. It's about striking out. It's about trying something new. They're trying to get you not to be seduced and fall prey to that villain, not going at all. And I guess for us at TCA, our enemy is, you know, business as usual, ad hoc, non-strategic content production, as we saw in the player model that doesn't form a good foundation. But let me ask you, Sonia, what would you say is Content Stack's villain?
Way to put me on the spot, Tim. Yeah, so that's a good question. I guess, and you can help me here, I guess I would say the company, no, it's not a company, obviously, the philosophy of sticking to like a brochureware website where there is no engagement, where we're not looking at content across the buyer journey. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think something like that, just from what I know about your business and about headless content management, that you know your villain or your enemy is channel specific or format specific or format centric content production and content production processes, right? So this, you know, an organization that got used to this notion of producing content for the digital content for the web, for the website, and what did they get? They got a web content management product, and now they're having trouble adapting, and again, as we were saying earlier, introducing the flexibility that will allow them to very easily serve content to any channels, any conceivable channels.
Yeah, absolutely. We spent a lot of time on this question, and we'll be sure to talk to Robert about it as well. We are
Excellent.
Unfortunately at the end of this webinar. Kendra, Anna, and Chris, I'll get back to your questions individually offline. Again, thank you, Tim, for this great webinar. Thank you also for taking these questions. Guys, if you like this, as Tim said, this is part of a 3-part series. The wonderful Kathy McKnight will April 7th walk you through content operations, and there's also going to be a worksheet attached that will help you come up with a governance framework for your content operations. I really urge you to join that. It's be very concrete around, you know, workflows and how to split up tasks and what skill sets you need to look for to make content marketing work. And with that, thank you all again for taking the time to join us live today. Have a great day or night, depending on where you are. And remember to wash your hands, guys. Stay safe. Goodbye from Content Stack.